welcome to the Ada Lovelace Day podcast. I'm Sue Charman-Anderson, and this month we're talking to neuroscientist Professor Sophie Scott about how our voices tell others more about us than we might realise. And science writer Simon Singh tells us the story of two incredible women, French mathematician Sophie Germain and American astronomer Henrietta Swan Leavitt. So this month we are talking to Professor Sophie Scott, who is a Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL. Hi Sophie.
Hi.
So I think some of our listeners who are familiar with Ada Lovelace Day Live might have seen your talk on laughter, and your focus is really on why people laugh. Is that right?
It's slightly more general than that. I'm interested in voices, really, and how we communicate with our voices. So I do work on speech and other sorts of emotions. It's all considerably less interesting than laughter. So, but people who have ever seen me do anything publicly, they'll normally have seen something on laughter because that's simply tolerable.
and I think as well that the talks about laughter are fun because you end up laughing.
Yes. Quite a deliberate decision. When I did my first talk on laughter a few years ago, I thought I've got to make this funny because if it's not funny, it's going to be unbearable. You know, there's something sort of awful about people treating laughter extremely seriously. And also I thought if people are laughing, perhaps they'll sometimes think about what they're doing.
I do admit my favourite line from your talk, actually it's one of my favourite lines from any of the talks, is basically something along the lines of laughter is your body trying to kill you.
Yes, it is highly stressful for your body. It's, for anybody who's healthy, it's fine. But you do generate very strong forces inside the rib cage, and that means that if you are cardiovascularly stressed, so maybe you have a heart weakness or problems with your lungs, it can be quite hard for you to laugh. I was reading a study recently where people had tried to there's a persistent belief that somehow the benefits of laughter can be translated into medicine, and people were working with individuals who got chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, which is a horrible problem where your lungs are really not working well and it's very difficult for you to breathe. And they were asking about people's laughter and their quality of life, and they were also running laughter sort of sessions with them where they'd be encouraged to laugh. And they had to immediately stop those because it was placing these people at terrible risk. Not really what anybody would want to be doing with their study.
Yeah, and mustn't laugh. However, moving away from laughter a little bit, you know, your work is broader than that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the other aspects of voice that you study?
Well, I'm really interested in how our brains control why we sound the way we do. So I'm talking to you now and I sort of feel like, I'm just speaking very naturally, but actually I'm not only selecting information about the linguistic stuff I want to say, I'm at some level also actually controlling the way I'm talking to you. So I'm talking to you in a way that is conveying as much who I am as who I'd like you to see me as. You know, it's quite an aspirational thing, the voice. So we're looking a lot at these issues around, you know, the control of the voice and why we sound the way we do and the things that affect that, from physical aspects of our environment through to social aspects of our environment. And I also look at the other side of it, which is how does your brain process that information when you hear it? So when you listen to somebody else's voice, how do you get all that information out? How do you pull out the meanings of the words? How do you pull out information about their emotional state and their identity? And how does this all kind of glue together? Because we know that you do use very talker-specific information to help you work out what somebody's doing with their voice. So it's not like it's all completely separate. So there's a very interesting network of brain areas to be looking at, because you're looking at perception and at production, but you're also looking at linguistic aspects, but also non-linguistic, social, emotional aspects. So it's a very, very complex, but a very interesting area. And historically, we've always looked at it in terms of language, because the spoken voice is a vehicle for language. We've tended to assume that's kind of what we're doing. And of course that is, but if I didn't say the right words to you right now, I would definitely fail to get my message across. There's a lot of other stuff that I'm conveying to you, some of it completely unintentionally. I keep coughing at you, and that's because I think that my hay fever's starting to start up a bit. You know, so there's, you know, you're getting information from my voice that I'm slightly asthmatic, and that kind of thing. Science always progresses this way, doesn't it? You don't really know necessarily what you're going to find when you start any study. And for me, it's been a lot of my career has been realising that I've always been working with voices. I thought I was studying speech, but in fact I've always been studying the voice.
So when you're talking about like information, are you talking about like the tone of voice that we use, like the timbre of voice that we use? Because I mean, I do notice with the podcast, you know, I'm trying to sound as if I've trained at the BBC half the time, and I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's what I seem to try to do, intentionally or otherwise.
So I'm talking to you very differently. I'm aware that this is for people listening to this won't be able to see me, so I'm perhaps being a bit more clear. I'm definitely trying to speak to you in a way that's conveying I'm a sensible professional and a knowledgeable person, and my mood is calm, and if I was buying fruit on Chapel Market, or if I was trying to tell somebody off, or if I'd just been arrested, but probably my voice would be different in all those situations, because I'd be trying to convey different sorts of information about myself. Certainly whenever I come from the north of England originally, and whenever I go anywhere towards the north of England, my accent immediately slides. And it only occurred to me recently, part of me talking like this, and to me, when I talk like this, I don't sound very northern, although I am still a bit northern. That's me being a proper academic, somehow I felt I had to lose my accent to be like this. So, well, I almost certainly didn't, but, it's, as I say, it's about aspiration and affiliation. And in fact, if you look, people will change their voice depending on who they're talking to. Even in just sort of experimental studies, men will raise the pitch of their voice the more they like the woman they're talking to. Just leave that one out there. But you really do it with people that you're very fond of. So when I've been on the phone to my mum, who lives abroad, I talk like her for ages afterwards. And my partner can tell when I've been on the phone to her, and love my mum. And I'm not really looking to talk like her, but I'm immediately changing my voice to sort of show our relationship. So it's a very interesting thing, because we think it's all about words, and actually it's a very emotional, very kind of socially bonding behaviour as well.
So that kind of starts to explain people. I'm trying to remember, I think it was John Barrowman who has this sort of mid-Atlantic-y kind of accent, and then when he talks to his family, suddenly he sounds Scottish. When he's in Scotland, and people can he's putting it on, and he's like, no, I'm bi-dialectic. I thought, what even is that? But that would actually make a lot of sense, that if he's talking to family, his birth accent, if you like, I don't know if that is exactly the explanation, but that his family context accent would come out.
Exactly that, and you might only do that around your family. You're showing something about your relationship with your family with your voice when you do that. I mean, people vary in this. Some people vary their accents a lot more. Other people really don't vary their accent very much at all. But everyone will change their voice to some extent, and everybody changes their voice a bit depending on who they're talking to. So it's an aspect of our identity where we can change things, even if we don't realise we can. Actually, famous people's voices are quite interesting, because you often see them kind of get picked up in the non-famous population. There was a period a few years ago, and everybody started talking like Ricky Gervais. Rick Mail, if you go back a few years, when that's my generation, we all talked like Rick Mail all the time when we were at school. We didn't really realise we were doing it. He was just such a popular and charismatic figure, and so influential to our, he felt like he was ours, So I can't look like Rick Mail, and I'm not as clever as Rick Mail, but I can talk a bit like him. And so, you find this happening. And in fact, my son recently got into some old radio programmes from the 50s, Hancock's Half Hour, which was a programme my dad used to listen to, and it had gone off the air for years before I was born. It's really, really old. It is very funny. We've enjoyed listening to it, but the really odd part for me was hearing my father, who loved the programme, and actually I hadn't really realised at all when he was alive, but he talked very like that, and he'd picked up all these different aspects of the voices. So he may not have even known he was doing it, but it's a nice, fun, aspirational thing that you can do. You can be a bit like these characters that amuse you, that you like, that you love. So it's a very sort of flexible and I keep saying aspirational, but it really is. We can change aspects of our voices that kind of make us more into what we'd like to be. And another example is women in the West over the last 50 years have really dropped the pitches of their voices. If you go back to old films from the 50s and earlier, the women are kind of pitching their voices up here. It seems to follow women coming into the workplace. And there's lots of stuff we can't do to make ourselves less female. We can bring up pitches of our voices down and be less alarming to men as a consequence. I mean, I'm a very good example. I'm definitely pitching my voice quite low. And if you go to parts of the world where women are not as well integrated into the workplace and sort of gendered behaviour is more kind of strictly separated, you tend to find women don't do this. So if you go to Japan, women speak with much higher pitches than women in the West, and they'll raise the pitch of their voice if there's a man around. They'll exaggerate the difference. And likewise, Japanese men speak with lower pitched voices than men in the West. So they are using voice pitch to exaggerate a difference, and we seem to be trying to minimise the difference that way.
Wow, I think you've just blown my mind. That's amazing. I had no idea that there was so much kind of social construction in how we speak.
Exactly, because it feels so kind of, we spend a lot of our life learning how to talk, And then, because the emphasis is all on what you're saying, and of course that's never not important, we learn a voice, and voices, and all our different ways of speaking. So I grew up in the north, but my parents were from the south, so I always, like John Barrowman to some extent, I spoke differently when I was at school than when I was at home. That kind of influence, everybody's got it going on, and different, your parents might come from different places, these different accents that kind of move in. So, like, on a personal level, it's a highly variable, very, very social phenomenon. And that's, of course, also happening at a societal level. So how we speak changes all the time. My son goes to school just around the corner from where I work in central London. And the vast majority of the children he's at school with don't produce the vowel sound in like, or bike, or mind, like I've just did it in what's called a diphthong, i.e. sort of mind, like. They produce a monophthong, they produce lack and back, lan, and it's very interesting, and it'll be interesting to see what happens to that, because this is a very natural process. It happens all the time, and sometimes it sticks, and sometimes it doesn't. So over my lifetime, people have moved from saying the word like tissue. People used to say tissue, and that's all driven by young people. So you get this kind of constant change pushing through from young people going upwards about how we say, the words generally stay the same, but the exact ways we pronounce it continuously change. And actually that still affects people over their lifetime. So if you look at someone who's been recorded over their whole lifetime, like the Queen or some presenters, what you see is they show the same shift. So the Queen has shown similar vowel shifts over her own lifetime. So nobody's told the Queen to talk differently, and the Queen hasn't chosen to speak differently. But she's still been, even though she's the Queen, influenced by these kind of shifts in how we talk that are actually affecting everybody.
It's funny you should mention the y sound. If I remember rightly, that's called yod, and it's been sort of leaving our pronunciation for a while. I remember, obviously my name is Sue, and I say that very simply, Sue. My gran used to call me Sue. I hated it. And I don't know why I hated it. I think it was maybe because she would emphasise the y sound when I was in trouble. But she was the only person around me who called me Susan. Susan. Drives me nuts even now, actually.
Isn't that interesting? I hadn't even realised when I used that example, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I just realised I can't remember when I last heard anybody say it, but I can definitely remember when I was younger, it would be quite a posh way of saying Sue. Like you're showing your more kind of classical roots. I don't mess around calling people Sue. I know how this is properly said.
And actually, that was very much a bugbear of hers, because I grew up in Dorset and grew up with a relatively sort of broad accent, even though neither of my parents grew up in Dorset. And my gran was always kind of, Susan, don't drop your H's! And very focused on developing a sort of received pronunciation accent in me, which ultimately, long after she died, I sort of ended up with a pseudo RP accent anyway. She'd probably be quite pleased.
Yeah, it's sometimes you don't almost know what your heart wants with these things. I'm always, I know everybody's surprised when they hear their voice, but I think that I don't sound at all northern anymore. And whenever I hear myself, I realise I still do. So I've kind of, it's interesting as well, because I think it sort of explains the flip side, which is that we do have very strong reactions to how other people speak. And sometimes that's completely irrational and just, you sort of, people getting really upset about young people talking differently. There's just no point, There's no point. But actually what that upset is very often a reaction to, if you think about voices being affiliative and aspirational, if somebody doesn't talk like you, they are pretty much saying, I don't care to talk like you. I don't want to sound like you. And I can remember it was she was a real person who was on The Apprentice, the television programme in the UK a few years ago. And she was called Louisa, and I couldn't stand how she spoke. She had this really kind of, that way of speaking. Oh, she'd speak properly, speak your words out. And I realised in the end, what I was basically saying was, I am old and she is young, and she has no interest in talking like women like me, and that's actually what I'm reacting to. And I very, even more kind of specifically, there was when all the fuss was coming out about Jimmy Savile, and there was some recording somebody found of Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols, a recording that was never broadcast, but he was saying, oh, Jimmy Savile's a terrible individual, gets up to awful stuff. But the thing that really jumped out at me was the interviewer, and she's interviewing him, Johnny Rotten, at the end of the 70s, and she speaks exactly like me. And I was clearly, that would have been when I was, sort of like 12, 13, and I'm speaking in a voice I would have aspired to speak like when I was peripubescent. And of course we all are, this is, and when we meet someone for whom that's different, it's a bit jarring. Like, don't we all want the same thing? Don't we all want to talk like me? It's sort of really putting it out there and saying, no, absolutely not. Look at me making a noise and not sounding like you.
Yeah, and isn't it, I think it's really interesting as well, because we watched some old TV over Christmas, specifically The Box of Delights, which was a sort of Christmassy TV show from my childhood, and my American husband had never heard of it, let alone seen it. And I don't think there was a single character, not a human character, in that series that didn't speak with a posh accent. That it was that sort of BBC English, and you realise how much BBC English dominated the public sphere of accents, I suppose.
Yeah, it was like an acceptable posh thing to sound like, wasn't it? But it's it's kind of this you should all aspire to this. But I think one of the things that's interesting is even within that, what we think of as BBC posh has changed. So it always gets less posh. So whenever you go back into the past, you think, oh, blimey, people did sound a lot posher, didn't they? Even the same person. But the only example I can think of where that doesn't happen is, and of course we don't have lots of recordings of people's voices, we only have it for relatively recent history. Prior to BBC RP accents, actually posh people didn't talk like that. The Queen Mother had a bit more, it was almost more of a Cockney accent, and that was actually part of the BBC imagining somehow you could produce a spoken voice that had no accent. Ended up with something we now think of as sounding posh, but actually that wasn't how posh people spoke then. We kind of invented this posh way of speaking.
Okay, mind blown for a second time in the same podcast. That is amazing.
It's really interesting. And also, people will glom onto bits of spoken language and voices and sort of say, because sometimes people feel like they're being very rational and objective when they complain about people's voices, although they're often just being as straightforward racist or sexist as they are about anything else. But so say, it's not intelligible. And I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, people started complaining about young women, particularly talking with what's called creaky voice or vocal fry, when you have a sort of slightly different sound to your voice, and it's kind of, you're actually holding your vocal folds under a different sort of tension, so you get a lower pitch and you get this sort of like a kind of creaky, slightly sort of fuzzy sound. And it's absolutely central to many American accents. Not all American people do it, but it's extremely common in the US. And it's common for young people and old people, and it's common for women, and it's common in men. And one of the great joys of people complaining about young women talking with what this vocal fry or vocal creak was very often people on the radio complaining about it who themselves were speaking with massive amounts of creak in their voice. And it's and it's just sort of a bias. It's not it's there, and we don't even necessarily know we're doing it. And in fact, in the UK, the exact same thing is again considered quite posh.
Some of this feels like, that people are using accent and voice and tone and vocal fry as a way to police groups that they want to control.
Yes, I think that's exactly what they do. And you can kind of fool yourself into thinking that you're being objective and saying, it means they're unintelligible, or, and it's just not true. Deborah Cameron, who's based at Oxford, and she's a very, very good linguist, and she's written extensively on this topic. She's pointed out that one of the reasons why people get really cross about voices and people using their voices wrong is because voices are like an active thing. It's something you're doing. If I just sat here, you wouldn't know anything about my voice. And as soon as I start talking, then you cannot not hear me. We can't close our ears. We can't redirect our ears. And it's sort of basically saying, I don't really like you, and yet here you are invading my ears. And so there is something very invasive about sound, and I think that kind of feeds into it as well. You can't avoid it. You can't. If the sound is within your audible range, then you're going to have to listen to it.
Yeah. No, I can understand that position very, very well. So do you have practical applications for it? Is there something where you're kind of thinking, well, once we've learned this, we can do something with it?
Obviously, what I do is considerably less interesting than a lot of what I've described here. So I'm doing a lot of stuff. We're looking at how the brain's involved when you're changing your voice or adapting to different situations. But one of the things I've got very interested in is possible ways that we can think about this in therapy, because a lot of people have speech and language problems after a stroke, and a lot of people have speech and language problems growing up, and it's a system which is complex and which can go wrong in many ways. But at the moment, what we tend to do with speech and language therapy is we target speech and language. And what we don't say is, ideas from, say, other disciplines where people use the voice, to think about other ways we could get people to change how they're sounding. So it's very interesting to me if I talk to beatboxers or actors or voice artists or impressionists, they always have a very different view of exactly the same instrument that I thought I knew about. You know, they hear the voice differently, they think about it differently when they're producing it. And we have some evidence that when they're actually doing this, they drive their brains differently. So if we think about voices rather than just speech, could it help us think about therapy? Could it help us think about different sorts of exercises we could be doing with people? Should we be learning more from acting?
And so what are some of the biggest challenges that you face when you're doing this kind of research?
Well, funding. It's hard to get funding and it's expensive work to do so. Specifically, actually, in the scanner, we use functional magnetic resonance imaging, and that can be very difficult to use with something like speech production or speech perception in the scanner because it's very noisy and you have to do a lot of stuff to deal with the fact that it makes a lot of sound. And also it's very sensitive to movement artifacts, so you have to be very careful that you don't just lose all your data because people move a lot when they speak. I think a third thing is sometimes getting people to take any of this seriously, because linguistics feels so kind of robust and clear and we've been studying it for a very long time. But actually voices, there's not much work and it's pretty new. As I say, the majority of the work is done on, when we think about people talking, we're thinking about the words they're saying and much less about all the other information in the voice. And actually that's really doubles down when you get to looking at emotional stuff like laughter, because people actually just think laughter's a stupid thing to study and it's trivial and pointless and silly, and you're sort of letting the whole team down in science by doing something so silly. So, you do start to butt right up to the edge of what people would be happy to tolerate as science. I've had people write, "Is this science?" on stuff I'm printing out, colleagues, because it just feels silly and like this just isn't serious. You're not doing this right,
That's it strikes me as being really actually quite weird that someone would look at laughter and think that it's not serious just because it involves laughter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because it's a very within the context of thinking about voices and communication, because I've been doing stuff on emotions in the voice for a long time, but only really when I got to laughter did I realise that this is an emotion that lives in social interactions. It doesn't live anywhere else. It's not like fear. You can scream when you're on your own, or disgust. It's something you literally pretty much only find laughter when you're with other people. You're 30 times more likely to laugh if there's somebody else there than if you're on your own. So actually part of a lot of normal vocal communication involves this non-verbal expression of emotion. And although we tend to think it's about humour, which is why I think another reason why it feels silly, actually most of the time when you laugh it's got nothing to do with humour. It's to do with making and maintaining social bonds and showing people that you agree with them and you like them and you're part of the same group as them and you understand what they're saying, and that you're doing all that with your laughter. So it's a tremendously important social behaviour, and we really should be looking more at it. We've just got to get past this feeling like it's silly.
Yeah. I guess as well there's a sense that when we're looking at social interactions and social behaviours, that maybe some people are sort of trained not to take that kind of thing as seriously. I mean, I do see a difference in the way that sort of men and women deal with social interactions and how seriously they take social interactions. And I wonder whether there's some influence there as well, that it's seen as a gendered thing.
I think it can be. Like there's a lot of myths around that men don't laugh and women laugh, and gosh, if I meet one more person with a lay theory about humour and mating strategies, I think I will actually call the police. I mean, it's one of those interesting things, because if you look, there are very, very few differences between men and women in how they use language and how they communicate. So, gosh, this is just a beautiful example. There's a lot of persistent belief that women talk more than men, and there's been 2 big meta-analyses now which have both found that although the effect size is small, there is a consistent difference between men and women in terms of speech production, which is that men speak more than women. It's a very, very small effect. It's a meaninglessly small effect, but the effect is in the direction of men speaking more, and there's just so much data it comes out significant. And it's modulated by context, and the situation where a man will talk most compared to a woman is when one man is talking to one woman. We've probably all been there. And then people say, oh, well, maybe men talk differently from women. Men are kind of going out and planning and organising hunting episodes, and women are gossiping whilst they gather fruit. And actually, that's also not true. Everybody gossips. It's arguably actually why we have language, is so we can gossip. It's one of the main things people do. And I think the only difference, to be completely trivial about it on this front, is that men get to call it networking sometimes, but that really is it. So that's the same. And in fact, laughter seems to work the same way. So pretty much everything we've seen about laughter in conversation is that you will laugh. Men and women laugh in these, in these social ways. They laugh with the people they know. In fact, the only difference I've seen very consistently is that, and with the proviso that there's very few studies on laughter, there's a difference between men and women with unfamiliar people. So everybody laughs more around people they know than people they don't know. Everybody catches a laugh, gets a contagious laugh more from someone they know than someone they don't know. But if you look at strangers, women are somewhat more likely to catch a laugh from an unfamiliar man than they are an unfamiliar woman, whereas men just are less likely to catch a laugh from unfamiliar anybody. So women, there is some evidence that women might be using laughter perhaps slightly differently in situations where they're around men they don't know. And given that it's all learnt, you learn contagious laughter, that's if that is the case, that's not because of some hardwired difference between men and women. It's almost certainly a strategy that women have learnt. It can be a way of kind of safely keeping people at arm's distance, like liking a tweet, just kind of, you got your laugh, okay, we're sort of we're on friendly grounds, but not crazy. Yeah.
So what's coming up for you next? What excites you in your immediate future?
Well, there's a few things that really excite me. One is that we are starting to be able to use the MRI machine, the magnetic resonance imaging machine, which we normally use to scan brains structurally, or we can use them to look at how brains are working when we're doing something like talking. We can now also use it like a video camera, and we can get somebody physically speaking or beatboxing or singing in the scanner, and instead of capturing their brain activation, what we're actually literally doing is making a movie of their articulators moving. And this is just amazing. This is really hard to see any other way, and it's quite spectacular. So this is something that I'm quite excited about, again, thinking about applied examples, because can we use this to really help speech and language therapists start to know a lot more about what's going on when someone's talking, because you can't see it. We can look at someone speaking and see their mouth moving, but you can't see what the tongue's doing, and you can't see how the tongue is very flexible and incredibly variable in how it can move, and you don't really know what's going on at all with any of that. And this is a technique that lets us look at that, and it's potentially, it's just fascinating to look at, but it's also potentially going to be very, very interesting for therapy.
As ever, I could continue this conversation for a lot longer, but thank you so much for talking to us today and for opening my eyes and ears to speech and accents and stuff.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks to Sophie for such a great conversation today. We've got links to Sophie's websites in our show notes, as well as her talk about laughter from Ada Lovelace Day Live 2013. And of course, you can follow her on Twitter @Sophie Scott. Our podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support of ARM, our exclusive semiconductor industry sponsor. You can find out more about ARM's energy-efficient microprocessor technology on their website @arm.com, and you can follow them on Twitter @ARMHoldings. If you'd like to join ARM as a co-sponsor of our podcast, then please email me at suw@findingada.com. Now this month we're looking at an invention that is perhaps a little esoteric, but if you fly a lot you may well have had first-hand experience of it. TATB, triamino trinitrobenzene, is a common explosive, more powerful than TNT, but incredibly stable and safe. It is very hard to detonate, and won't accidentally explode, not even in plane crashes or fires. So it's no surprise that TATB is widely used around the world. But as with any other explosive, you really don't want it hanging about in waste or contaminating land. The problem with TATB was that it was very hard to identify in the field, and when you're cleaning up hazardous waste, you do need to know what you're dealing with before you start treating the contamination. Enter Dr. Betty Harris. Harris started university aged just 16, getting her chemistry degree at age 19, before earning a master's from Atlanta University. After 10 years of teaching chemistry and maths at the Southern University in New Orleans, she took a position at the Los Alamos National Laboratory and completed her doctorate in chemistry at the University of New Mexico. It was at Los Alamos that Harris worked on treating hazardous waste and restoring environments contaminated with explosives, propellants and fuels. The lab was focused on cleaning up the explosives corridor at Los Alamos, including test sites, decommissioned and active buildings and research labs. TATB was hard to detect at the time because it is insoluble in most common solvents, and because the test reagents that might have worked were either unstable or not specific enough to pick out TATB from other compounds. In the 1980s, Harris developed a way to detect TATB in the field. She washed the sample with a solvent, such as acetone, to remove contaminants like TNT, and then used a reagent that turns bright orange in the presence of TATB. The test was simple, sensitive, and specific to TATB. Harris was awarded a patent for her TATB spot test in 1986. Harris was also an advocate for science education, developing the Girl Scout Chemistry Badge and a support project for high school students interested in science. She said of her own high school experience in the book African American Women Chemists by Jeanette Brown, "I thank Dr. Edward S. Jenkins, my high school science teacher, for 2 projects that made me think, write and wonder about the possibilities of science. Project 1 was making firecrackers from basic materials. Project 2 involved fermentation and counting yeast cells under a microscope. The product from Project 1 did not explode with a loud enough bang and had to be redone. Project 2 did explode, and I had to clean up my mother's pantry where I was keeping my jars in which I grew the yeast. I forgot to open them at the interval given in the experiment." Nowadays, Dr. Harris's invention is used to screen airline passengers for traces of explosives at airports, as well as to help clean up contaminated land. So thank you, Dr. Betty Harris, for making us a little bit safer and making our world a little bit cleaner. So I would like to welcome science writer Simon Singh to the podcast this month. Hi, Simon.
Hello.
Who are the women that you've come across that have caught your eye, whose work you admire?
I suppose my first book was all about Fermat's last theorem, and before that I made a film for the BBC about it. And if we go back through the history of Fermat's last theorem, there's a woman who didn't appear in the documentary, because in the documentary the mathematicians who are alive today are so brilliant and eloquent and tell the story of Fermat's last theorem so well that the documentary very much focuses on a few key figures that are alive today. So the historical characters kind of dropped out of the film. But when I wrote the book, there was plenty of space for them. And I suppose the most notable case is Sophie Germain, a French mathematician who was born in, late 1700s in Paris. And as you might expect at that time, women were largely discouraged from doing mathematics, and it really wasn't seen as a female pursuit. But Sophie was very dedicated, and as a young girl, she would work late into the night. And I think her parents had to confiscate her candles so that she didn't do maths when she was supposed to be dreaming of other things. But anyway, she grew up and she became a very fine, confident young mathematician. But the next barrier was entry into the local universities, I suppose. Women weren't really allowed to study at the university. But there was a fortunate incident relating to a mathematician, or a student mathematician, called Monsieur Leblanc. And he was studying mathematics and he dropped out of the course. And Sophie somehow heard about this, and she sort of took on his identity. She would attend the lectures, or she would collect the problem sheets and submit her answers in his name, get them marked, collect them again. And by pretending to be Monsieur Leblanc, she was able to pursue mathematics at the university. The problem was that Monsieur Leblanc presumably dropped out because he was not very good at maths, and Sophie was pretty amazing. And so the tutor probably got suspicious and said, what's happened to this Monsieur Leblanc? I demand to see, when they collect their problem sheets, ask them to come and see me, or something along those lines. and he was shocked to find that Monsieur Leblanc was now a Mademoiselle Germain. She had to obviously disclose her true identity. But from that point on, I think because she'd proved her worth, she was to some extent accepted into the fold, and she became, in time, an absolutely first-rate, world-class mathematician who also made contributions in sort of engineering and physics. And one of her contributions was about the sort of the stresses and strains related to metals and materials. And so her work was pretty important in terms of helping to design and build something like the Eiffel Tower. And although the Eiffel Tower names many great scientists and engineers, I think they're probably engraved on it somewhere. Unfortunately, I think Sophie's name is missing, but I might be wrong, but I think she was probably left out, which I suppose is fairly typical for these sort of things.
Yeah, and she started off doing sort of number theory, and then she sort of moved on to elastic surfaces. So the experiment that I think has been on TV quite a bit with the vibrating metal plate, and she was trying to explain mathematically what was happening with that.
Yes, I think they're called Chladni plates or something, and yeah, it's a lovely demonstration. I'm not quite sure how her work fits into this, but if you take a square piece of metal and you fix it in the middle, and you pour, say, flour over the top or talcum powder, if you then vibrate the edge of the plate, perhaps with a violin bow or something, and the whole plate begins to shudder, depending on the frequency of the vibrations, different patterns will emerge. And those bits of the plate that are jumping wildly will throw the flour away, and those bits of the plate, I suppose the nodes, which aren't moving, the flour or talcum powder settles. So you get these wonderful patterns that emerge. And if people YouTube Chladni plates, they'll see some of these beautiful dynamic patterns forming. She straddled both sides of applied mathematics and pure mathematics. When it came to Fermat's last theorem is about trying to prove that a whole set of equations have no non-trivial whole number solutions. And without going into any detail, she sort of began to figure out why at least some of these equations might not have any solutions. And so her work directly led to other mathematicians being able to prove Fermat's last theorem to some extent. But the problem with Fermat's last theorem is it applies to an infinity of equations. So even if you solve it for 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 equations, you've still got infinitely many left. But it was still the most remarkable breakthrough at its time in the context of Fermat's last theorem. My most recent book is about the Simpsons. The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets is what it's called. And it's about the fact that the writers of The Simpsons, a lot of them are mathematicians, first rate, PhDs. One was even a Harvard professor, and they've quit maths to become comedy writers. In fact, they've become the world's most successful comedy writers, I suppose. And in one episode, obviously, a lot of the math is kind of sprinkled around, but quite a bit of it relates to Lisa Simpson because she's obviously the kind of top nerd on the program. And in one episode, she sort of mirrors the story of Sophie Germain. I think it's an episode called Girls Just Want to Have Sums. Essentially, the girls feel they're not being treated fairly. So the school is split into two, a girls' school and a boys' school. And the girls and the boys are taught separately. And this seems like a good idea initially. Problem was it completely backfired because the teacher who was teaching the girls was incredibly patronizing. Lisa would say, we need to do more problems. And the teacher would say, problems, that's how boys see the world. This is much more an exploration rather than problems. And she's really kind of touchy-feely about mathematics in a way that really annoys Lisa. And so she dresses up as a boy and goes and joins the boys' class. And just like Sophie dressed up, or didn't dress up, but took on the identity of Monsieur Leblanc. And then when Lisa moves across, she obviously becomes the star pupil in the boys' school and eventually reveals her true identity at the end of the episode. I think that whole episode was prompted by a bit of a scandal in America when the president of Harvard questioned whether women were as talented as men when it came to mathematics. So that episode of The Simpsons was, I think, a direct response to that. And as I say, mirrors the Sophie Germain story.
Germain's story is actually, to me, also really a story about persistence as well, because she tried 3 times to win the Paris Academy of Sciences prize for the work she did on metal plates and the elastic surfaces. I mean, she really didn't give up. She persisted in a way that I think is something we should probably all learn from.
Yeah, and I think throughout her life she was also still a little bit worried about whether people would take her seriously. She entered into a correspondence with Gauss, the great German mathematician. At this stage of her life, she was a well-recognised mathematician in France, but Gauss had never heard of her. So again, she took on a male identity in her correspondence with him. And it was only when, I think Napoleon's army started tearing across Germany and she feared for Gauss's life, and she knew, or her family knew, senior figures in the military, and she sent through a request to say that Gauss's life should be particularly cautioned to make sure that he remained safe. That's when Gauss found out who his correspondent truly was, that it wasn't a man, but rather a woman called Sophie Germain. And he responded very warmly to her. But again, I suppose by this stage he'd already established with him that she was a first-rate mathematician.
Now, if we kind of move 100 years later, there's an astronomer you wanted to talk about as well.
Yeah, my third book, called Big Bang, and it's all about the history of cosmology. And I suppose one of the things that people needed to do in cosmology, one of the reasons we know there's a Big Bang is because the galaxies are all racing away from us. And that's due to this thing called the redshift that people may know about. The galaxies are all redshifted because they're moving away from us. Now, if you're going to do these kind of measurements, you do need to know the colour of the galaxies. You need to know this redshift business. But you also need to know their distance. And this is a really difficult thing to do in astronomy or cosmology. Measuring distances far across the universe for a long time was impossible. But the person who cracked the mystery for cosmic scales of distance was a woman called Henrietta Leavitt. And Henrietta Leavitt worked at the Harvard Observatory. She worked in the observatory of Edward Pickering, who was the director of the observatory. And what would happen is that the men would go out at night and make the observations, because I suppose being out in the cold, in the dark, was kind of man's work, as it was perceived at the time. And they would take photographs. I think it's interesting to mention that astronomers pioneered a lot of photography, because taking a portrait of somebody in front of you with a big flash is a piece of cake compared to photographing a dim and distant speck of light across the universe. So they really pushed the technology, and I think words like positive and negative and snapshot all come out of astronomy. But anyway, these men would take the photographs, and then next morning they'd deliver them to a group of women who were known as Pickering's harem, I think. These women were known as computers. We now think of a computer as a machine that does calculations, whereas originally a computer meant a person who did calculations. So these women would set to work measuring the position of the stars on the photographic plates, the brightness, the colour, that kind of thing. Henrietta Leavitt, she was one of these computers in Harvard. She realised, and in fact lots of the women there realised, that they had the data. And in science, if you have the data, you can do the science, okay? Gathering the data is one thing, but using it and analysing it, that's where the new ideas emerge. And there's a whole gang of women here who made great discoveries in their own right. But what Henrietta Leavitt did that was particularly remarkable was that she noticed that on some of these plates, night to night, there were stars that were varying in brightness, undulating. They would go brighter and dimmer, sometimes over the course of a week, sometimes over the course of a month. And these stars are known as Cepheid variables. Henrietta, by the way, was profoundly deaf, and so it's quite possible that, having lost one sense, that her eyesight became more acute and she could see things in these photos that other people couldn't see. That's possibly true. What she really noticed that was really important was she could measure the distance, or astronomers could measure the distance to local Cepheid variables, ones that were just within our galaxy. And she could see the variation of brightness. And she realized that there was a direct relationship between the period of brightness of a Cepheid and the actual brightness. So from memory, the brighter a Cepheid is, the longer it takes to vary in brightness. The dimmer it is, the quicker it varies in brightness. Now, this is a really crucial relationship, because once you know this, you can look at any galaxy across space, find a Cepheid variable inside the galaxy, measure how quickly it's varying. Once you know how quickly it's varying, you know its absolute brightness, because there's a relationship between the period of variation and the brightness. You know its absolute brightness. You can then see how bright it appears to be, and that will tell you the distance, the relationship between the absolute brightness and the apparent brightness. So it's like if you were standing out on a moorland on a dark night and you could see somebody shining a light bulb. Now, you don't know if that's a 100-watt light bulb a long way away or a 50-watt light bulb much closer. But once you establish the wattage of the light bulb, then you can work out the distance. So it was an absolutely groundbreaking discovery, and it transformed, it was really at the start of modern cosmology.
And she actually looked at literally hundreds and hundreds of variable stars. I mean, she did a vast amount of work kind of measuring and cataloguing these stars.
I guess with all science there's a certain level of drudgery, but her core work was that drudgery. You know, she'd be looking at these plates day after day, and again, if people Google this and go online, you'll see beautiful photos of these computers, human computers, staring at these photographic plates. And, you know, that they could have just done that. If they'd have done that, written down the results, passed them back, that's all that was ever asked of them. But it was going further than that really was the extraordinary thing. That's what really makes her a truly brilliant scientist and one of the great astronomers.
We could continue talking, I think, for a long time, but thank you so much for your time, Simon. It's been really fascinating.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you. Cheers.
Thanks to Simon for taking the time to talk to us about Sophie and Henrietta. You can find out more about Simon on his website, simonsingh.net, and you can follow him on Twitter @SLSingh. Simon's got several books out that are well worth a look: The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets, Fermat's Enigma, and The Codebook, to name just 3. We have, of course, got links to those in our show notes. Thanks again to our sponsor, ARM, for their ongoing support. If you'd like to join them as a podcast sponsor, please do get in touch. Thanks also to our editor, Andrew Marks. Don't forget that you can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play and Stitcher. Please do rate, review and share our podcast with your friends. And thanks to everyone who's already helped us out with a review and a share. Next month, we'll be talking about plastic electronics and solar power with Dr. Jess Wade, and the author of Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookshop, Robin Sloan, is going to tell us about one of his favourite science fiction writers. So thanks for listening, and join us next month.